Okay, I'm Stan Russell. I've been married to Ernestine for almost 36 years. We've got 3 kids, Erin and her husband Josh. They live in Wichita. And our son Ryan is in South Korea teaching English as a second language over there. He's been there. He's finishing his 2nd year. And Emily, our youngest, is a college graduate, still looking for that job. And I'm ready for her to get that job. I love her, but it's time. I work in telecommunications. I've worked for Pizza Hut for 27 years. I've been doing telecom going on 36 years, I think. A long time. We had touch tone back when I started phones, so it's not that old. We've been here. We moved to Texas in '98 when it was so hot, and my wife thought I had taken her to hell, literally. That was the summer of the crickets also, and so it was an unusual migration down here. And we found McKinney, just down the street from our house that year in the fall, and we've been here ever since. I love this church. It's the people are real, and we just have enjoyed being here and serving here. We've led life groups. We've participated in life groups now, and back in February, I became the director of men's ministry. So throughout this year, I've learned a lot of things. I've been challenged, and I feel like I'm still drinking from a fire hose sometimes in terms of all the rules that I've got to learn and all the things that I've got to understand. But it's been a blessing. And I titled this my talk, "A Trial, a Miracle, and How Santa Became Part of My Life." My daughter cautioned me about, "Dad, you tell the story, you know it really well, but you kind of get bogged down in details." And I tried to share with her. I said, "Well, hon, if I'm going to talk about how bad the trial was, you have to hear some of the details." And so, guys, I'm going to jump in, and I'll tell you the story. Saturday, January 28th, 1995 was our 17th wedding anniversary. And I'll say this right now. I wrote this out so that I wouldn't go off into the weeds. And I could do that. So I'm going to probably read most of it, and I may deviate. And you'll probably be able to tell when I jump through it. I'd spent the afternoon shopping for a surprise anniversary present for my wife, a new dishwasher. Our old one had conked out a couple of weeks earlier, and I was just getting around to replacing it. I'm really a romantic kind of guy, aren't I? It was about 7:30 in the evening, about the same time that we had said our vows on another cold January Saturday night. Ernestine and I had been spending the evening together alone. There was music playing softly in the background. I held her hand, and I told her just how much I loved her. But Ernestine didn't know what was going on. She didn't know that it was our anniversary. She didn't know I was even there talking to her, because she was in a drug-induced coma and been on life support for a week. The ventilator that was keeping her alive was breathing 60 times a minute. Oxygen level was set at 100%, and the pressure that they can pump into her was set as high as they could do without hurting her. And every time the machine took a breath, it literally shook her body. Standing by her bed, I held her hand, and I leaned over and I softly told her, I said, "Ernestine, 17 years ago right now, I promised that I'd love you, and I'd honor you, and I'd cherish you until death separated us." Well, here we are, sweetie. It's 17 years later. We're in the hospital, and I'm still here, and I'm not going anywhere. Then I leaned over and I kissed her, and the machine continued to breathe for her. Life is precious, life is fragile, and life doesn't always go in the direction we think it's going to. You can be healthy one day and on death's doorstep the next. Ernestine had been the picture of health just 2 weeks earlier. I brought her to the hospital on Monday, January 16th. She had been sick at home for a week. In the ER, she was diagnosed with blood poisoning and pneumonia. I didn't have a clue, really, as to the severity of her condition at that time. She had pneumonia a couple of times earlier. She'd gotten over that. Plus, I'd gotten her to the hospital. So now, She was where she belonged, and she'd get the care that she needed, and I was relieved. Everything would be okay. But as my mother-in-law and I were walking down the corridor that afternoon and talking, Ernestine's doctor came up to us, and he said, "You guys need to know, Ernestine is a very, very sick lady, and she may not make it." And I was stunned. I never, ever thought that she was that sick. Among the handful of verses that I'd memorized over the years, two became particularly important to me at that point and even to today, all the way through. Proverbs 3, 5, and 6 say, "Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he will make your paths straight." And to go with that one, Philippians 4, 6, and 7. "Do not be anxious about anything, but in every situation by prayer and petition with thanksgiving, present your request to God, and the peace of God, which transcends all understanding, will guard your hearts and minds in Christ Jesus." I grew up a lot right then. I knew I had to have a talk with God, the kind of talk that I'd not had with him before. But it wasn't as hard a conversation as you might have thought. Ernestine and I both have and had a deep, abiding faith that God is in control. He's always in control, and we know we can trust him totally, even though we don't know where we're going. We can tell him what we need, we can tell him what we're thinking, and we can tell him how we're feeling. And I already knew that day that God was going to lead us through this awful thing we were facing. So when I talked to God, I gave him what was already his daughter. This is one thing that's hard for me sometimes. I can talk about the story, and sometimes it just flashes all over me. I didn't know what decisions were facing me, and I didn't know if she was going to live or die. And I knew I couldn't fix her. But we knew, and I knew, that we could trust Jesus no matter what happened. And do you know what happened after that? That peace that transcends all understanding was mine. I didn't know where we were going. I didn't know what I was going to be facing. But I knew that God was going to take care of Ernestine. At the same time, he was going to take care of me and the kids too. So that was Monday. The next day, on Tuesday morning, Ernestine's mom was in the room with her, and I was in the waiting room with her dad, our minister and his wife, and a good friend from church. Ernestine's dad had had health problems since a major heart attack in '75, and his health was always a concern. So this morning, we're sitting around a table just talking, and his eyes rolled back in his head. He moaned and collapsed in my arms. Medical staff came out of everywhere, and I heard someone holler for a crash cart. They were able to stabilize Dad after a little bit, and they put him in a room in MICU directly across the hallway from Ernestine because CICU was full. So they told us if this had happened outside the hospital as they were parking the car and walking in, he wouldn't have made it. So we didn't tell Ernestine what had happened. She was in no shape to hear that kind of information right then. So we spent time going back and forth right literally across the hallway from one room to another, checking on both patients. On Wednesday, I authorized a lung biopsy for Ernestine so the doctors could determine the extent of the disease, and the results showed that it was extensive. The doctors began talking to me about something that was called ARDS, Adult Respiratory Distress Syndrome. And as best as I can describe this, and that's a condition where diseased lung tissue puts toxins into the lungs, which damages healthy tissue, which then in turn puts toxins back into the lungs, and fluid builds up, and the patients are not unable to get an adequate oxygen supply. And in severe cases, it's often fatal. So she came out of surgery on the ventilator. They told me to expect that, but it should just be for a few days. On Thursday, she had her first crisis. I had to run an errand, and I was out of the hospital for a while, but when I came back into her room, I walked in, and her bed had been elevated as high as it would go, and it was flat out, and there were about 5 people standing around her, all in surgical garb, with some machine in there with her that I had never seen before. Ernestine's lungs had clogged up with mucus plugs, and they were literally suffocating her, and so her O2 sats had dropped down into low, dangerous areas, and so they were literally vacuuming the crud out of her lungs. That appeared to work because she stabilized after that, and we kind of continued on. When I took Ernestine to the hospital on Monday, I called Jackie to let her know what was going on. Jackie and Lawrence were our best friends at church. They were our best friends, period, in Wichita. We met them 11 years earlier at church, and our families are and were still, very good, very close. Jackie told me when I talked to her, she said, just tell me what you need and I'll see that it's done. I've always referred to Jackie as my Jeep driver during this time. She knew what I needed when I didn't know what I needed, and she took care of things. Jackie arranged for the kids to go to a neighbor's house after school until I could get home. Jackie arranged for meals to be brought to us, and Jackie arranged for people to come to our house in the evening to sit with the kids so I could go back to the hospital. On Saturday evening, that first week, Jackie had arranged for the kids to stay with friends who would see to it that they got to church on Sunday. That allowed me to stay late that first Saturday night at the hospital and be able to go to church on Sunday morning. So on Sunday morning, I decided to stop by the hospital before I went to church. But I wasn't prepared for what I saw when I walked in. Maggie, the nurse, was standing beside Ernestine's bed, and she was bagging on her. And she looked over her shoulder at me, and she said, I've been doing this for about 40 minutes, and she's not responding very well. You ought to call your family. So, it appeared that my wife was dying, and it looked like she only had a short time left. So I made 2 phone calls. I called my mother-in-law, and I called Jackie. Soon my children and extended family were at the hospital. Ernestine's dad was still there. He was brought in from CICU that had a room now, and he was sitting in a wheelchair beside her bed saying goodbye to his daughter. I was told later that an announcement had been made at church that Ernestine was very near death, and that dozens of people came forward to pray for Ernestine and for our family. It was just all so surreal. The doctor explained to me what was happening and what was going to happen. He told me that her lungs were filling with fluid and her O2 sats now were down in the 60s. He said, this is going to cause her heart rate to increase faster and faster, trying to pump oxygen into her body. He said eventually she'd go into cardiac arrest. And then he said, when that happens, Stan, what do you want to do? And I'd say to everybody, if you haven't had this discussion with your wife or your parents, to do so in advance of having to make a decision. What I had to do was really not a decision that needed to be made at that time. It should have been done ahead of time. So I would really encourage you to consider asking yourself, when that happens, what do you want to do? So I choked back some tears, I took a deep breath, and I told the doctor, if that happens, I don't want her to suffer, let her go. About 10 minutes later, I signed my first DNR, Do Not Resuscitate order. I totally understood that if God was going to take Ernestine, nothing we could do could stop that. And I also understood that if God was ready to leave her there, that he would take care of the details necessary to keep her alive. In a short time, God began to show us that he was taking care of those details. The pulmonary tech on duty that weekend wasn't just any tech. She was the director of the department. I found out on Saturday that she came in on a regular basis and took shifts so she could stay sharp, so she could stay up on what was going on. I also found out she was a Christian. Because of Ernestine's restlessness, she wanted the doctor to approve to putting Ernestine into a drug-induced coma. Every time she moved her head or coughed, her O2 sats would just drop. Doctor felt that it couldn't hurt anything, so he approved it. Ernestine was administered a heavy sedation and a paralyzing drug. So now she was totally dependent on the ventilator to keep her alive. The goal was to give her body a chance to heal. So other details that God was taking care of, members of our church came to the hospital, and before I knew it, there were about 30 people gathered in a circle in the MICU waiting room, offering prayer for Ernestine's life. Little by little, Ernestine's oxygen levels began to rise. Not much, but just a little. By early evening, they managed to get them up between 86 and 88%. And that's where we leveled off at that point in time. Then that night, 3 very good friends from church, Barb, Karen, and Justin, kept a bedside prayer vigil over Ernestine until the wee hours of the morning. Barb stayed after the others had left, praising Jesus and praying for Ernestine. And she was still there in the morning when I got there about 9 o'clock. God had preserved Ernestine's life, perhaps just for the time being, but we were grateful. And we quickly settled into a daily routine that would last for months. During her 166 days in the hospital, I never stayed a night with her. I had 3 kids that needed me, and I needed to be with them as much as I could. The kids were with me almost every night except Saturday nights. Every morning upon waking, I immediately called the nurse's station, to find out how her night was. Then I'd get the kids up and make sure that they were dressed as appropriately as a dad can get kids dressed. Amen. Amen to that. I'd feed them and get them off to school or to the bus or over to the neighbor's house to wait for the bus there. Then I got myself ready with the goal of being at the hospital by 9 o'clock by the time the doctors would begin to make their rounds. Getting to the hospital, I'd go get my coffee. I'd find my way to Ernestine's room. I'd give her a kiss, and I'd settle into my chair and wait for the doctors. I'd leave the hospital about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, about the time Ernestine's mom and dad would come to visit her. I would head out to pick up the kids from the neighbors and head home so they could do their homework and we could have dinner. On Monday, Wednesdays, and Fridays, someone would bring us a meal. I had to stop dinners coming from every day because there was just way too much food for 1 adult and 3 kids. And, you can only eat so much lasagna. Yeah, you heard that? That'll preach too. We'd have dinner. We'd talk about school. We'd talk about mom. We'd talk about stuff. We tried to be as normal as we could be. And after dinner, somebody from church would come in, and they would sit with the kids till I came home. And while I was gone, sometimes they did laundry. Sometimes they cleaned the house a little. I would go back to the hospital for the evening, arriving about shift change, about 7 o'clock, and I'd stay till about 10:30, so I could let the sitter go home by 11. And every night, just before turning off the lights, I'd call the nurse's station again, just to check on how Ernestine was since I'd left an hour earlier. The next day, I'd do this routine all over again. God showed me also that he was still taking care of details when it came to my job. My employer paid me my regular salary for months with marginal participation from me. My VP told me that family comes first, take whatever time you need, and he meant it. The only modification to my daily schedule came in April when I started going back to work half days. I would leave the hospital about 11:20, 11:30 so I could be to the office by noon. But my morning and evening routines didn't change, not until Ernestine went to rehab in the beginning of June. All of this isn't to say that there weren't some very dark days for us, very troubling and very sad days. We had multiple crises. Ernestine had multiple infections and several additional bouts of pneumonia and a number of complications. And her weight went down to about 72 pounds. There was this one Sunday in March that I received a message from an usher while I was in church. They tapped me on the shoulder and said, "Ernestine's mom and dad are at the hospital, and Ernestine's asking for you." Well, this was new. This had not happened before, so I didn't know what was going on. When I walked into her room, I looked at Ernestine, who now weighed her 73 pounds, and she was in total despair and looked to be without hope. For a week or so, the doctors had been weaning her off the ventilator, and so which meant that she spent some time each day breathing on her own, building up her strength. And then they'd put her back on the vent so she could rest. I was told that every time that she was breathing on her own at this point, she was feeling like she had just run a marathon. She was just totally exhausted. I kissed her, and I asked her what was going on. Now, Ernestine couldn't talk, and she had very limited movement. But we had found that she had enough strength to take the marker or a pen of a magic doodle. You know what that is? With the magnetic thing that you can draw on it, and you can read it. She took the pen, and with a real shaky hand, she wrote, "I'm done." I asked her what she meant. I tried to read her lips, which I could do most of the time, but she finally wrote, "Put me to sleep." Well, a number of interpretations of that ran through my head, and one of them I didn't want to think of. After a few minutes, I finally understood. She was ready to go to sleep and not wake up. She was done, and she wanted us to take care of it. I explained to her that she was feeling so tired because she was working those muscles and trying to get her strength up. And I reminded her about all the progress that she had made over the past several months. I told her, "You can't give up now. I'm not going to let you. Come on, God's with us. Let's go." I told her that they were ready to turn the vent back on to give her some rest. And then she nodded. I also told her that the doctor had ordered something to help her relax and rest and sleep. And then her eyes got big. She thought that we were now ready to do what she asked us to do earlier, but she was past that. She said she thought we were going to put her out. And I said I assured her that she would wake up, she would feel better. So she relaxed and smiled, and things were okay at that point. During each crisis and during even the ordinary days, God provided His grace, mercy, and strength to take each day as it came. His blessings and provisions we experienced were so many. And I can't even begin to count them all, but I counted a number of them. The preservation of Ernestine's life, God's grace, strength, and peace provided by the Holy Spirit to endure each day and the hardship as it came. The prayers offered by friends, family, and even strangers alike. The God-chosen team of doctors who cared for Ernestine. The nurses who cared for Ernestine, and I learned firsthand that they don't only just take care of the person in the bed, they also take care of the person sitting next to the person in the bed. The protection of my job and the explicit instructions to take care of my family. My friends at work who took up cash donations, the love and support of our family, the love and support and cooperation of three great kids who were 12, Aaron was 12, Ryan was 9, and Emily was 7. During a time when their mother was near death for weeks and spent a half a year in the hospital, nobody went wheels off, which could have happened. They did a great job. The love and support of our church family in so many ways. Okay. Jackie's love and support to coordinate the teams of people who took care of us. The friends who brought over 100 meals to our house for 6 months. The friends who cleaned our house for months. The friends who mowed my yard, did our laundry for months. The friends who provided over 160 days of child care before school, after school, and in the evening. The friends who sat with me at church. The friends and family who sat with Ernestine every day for 2 months after she came home from the hospital because she was too weak to care for herself. The sweet elderly lady at church who wrote Ernestine an encouraging card every day, every month, every week for months. The 24 handwritten get well cards from 24 third graders at Ernestine School where she volunteered. The friends who came and sang to Ernestine when she was in the coma. The friend who came and played her flute for her when she was asleep. Barb, Karen, and Justin who kept the overnight prayer vigil. The nurses who cared for me, hugged me during those hard days. The nurses who brought me food. And they knew that they learned soon that was a way to my heart. The clown who came in and made Ernestine smile when she was awake. The peace and calmness that was felt by so many when they came into our room because they heard Christian music playing almost constantly for months. The decision for Christ that was made by a friend at church when he considered how fleeting life can really be. The rededication to Christ by Ernestine's primary doctor. The preservation of my health during that time, and the preservation of Ernestine's dad's life from day 2, and the huge blessing I received on the Saturday afternoon of February the 11th, when Ernestine opened her eyes for the first time in 21 days. And the first thing I wondered is, how is she? Is she okay? Her oxygen levels had been so low for so long, I wasn't sure what I was going to see or how she was going to be. But she gave me she couldn't talk and she couldn't move, but she gave me a clue that she was in there. She scrunched her nose at me, which was her sign. Then, following, so Ernestine gradually got better, and over months and then rehab and everything, we eventually came home. And it lasted a year. In the fall of that year, our church did what they call a lay witness mission. If you're familiar from a Methodist church, a lay witness mission is basically would be like if Chase Oaks, people from there, came to Christ Fellowship for a weekend and they took care of everything. They took care of the children's programming, they took care of the music, they took care of the worship and the sermon and everything. Well, we were there on a Friday night and they were sharing testimonies. And during a time of prayer and quiet, it just came all over me. I was so tired. I was so worn out. I felt brittle. I felt like desert. And I just kind of broke down. And I was just talking to God about what all had happened and how it was supposed to go on. And no sooner had I said that than I felt a tap on my right shoulder. And I turned around and looked, and there was a lady there from the other church. And she said, "Are you Stan and Ernestine?" We said, "Yeah." She said, "We just want you to know that our Sunday school group has been praying for you for months." God gave me exactly what I needed when I needed it. And he didn't waste any time in giving it to me either. It was just literally seconds. So, there are two sides to the story. You've heard mine today, and someday maybe we can get Ernestine to share hers. But this was indeed the most intense and stressful and most physically and emotionally draining time in my life. And there's not a day goes by now that I'm not reminded of how it changed Ernestine's life, my life, and the life of our family. She's got, for years following her being sick, she was as okay as she could be. She didn't need oxygen. She wasn't able to go back to work. But life began a new kind of normal. Even about 2 years after her being sick, we had gone to a lake Sunday school party. We'd all gone out to a lake and guys brought their boats. And next thing I know, Ernestine had gone for a ride with the kids, and somebody said, "Look, Stan, there's Ernestine." And I looked up, and Ernestine's going by skiing. She was an easy skier. As little as she is, she pops out of the water like nothing. But she had enough strength to ski. She was even able, on 1 or 2 occasions, to play her flute, even though with greatly diminished lung capacity. She's got 40% lung capacity. So, out of all this, Ernestine's faith is stronger, my faith is stronger, and we both found the courage and the desire to talk to other people who have gone through or going through the same kind of situation that she was in. Over the years, we've come across through some God-appointed arrangements, about 6 or 7 families in the hospital who were facing somebody being on the ventilator with ARDS and not knowing what's going on. And we were able to share with them that there is hope, and God will handle things. You have to trust Him, and that Ernestine was living proof that God does answer prayer. And the experience also just changed my heart to terms for people who are hurting. So the last part of this title was how Santa became part of my life. 2 years, well, we lost 95 altogether. In 96, going into the fall, I was asked if I would do a children's Christmas party. Now, I hadn't played Santa before. I didn't have the padding. I had to build padding. I had to rent a suit, and I had to get whiskers and a beard too, and white hair, because I still had color and I still had hair. But I had my first opportunity to share with kids in a hospice for a Christmas program. And I was worried about it. And I even went to our counselor at church and I asked, what do I say? What do I do if they ask me about being sick? And she just kind of patted me on the shoulder and said, they're there. She said, they're kids. They're not going to ask about that. And nobody did. If they were to do that now, I might have an answer for them, but then I didn't have to address that. But other things that have happened following that, I had the opportunity to do the Christmas parties for Wichita hospitals, the 2 major hospitals in Wichita, and I did them both for 2 years. I also and today this would never happen, I contacted a safe house for battered women and their children. It was listed in the paper as places that needed places to volunteer. And there was a big list, and I just pulled one out. And I called and talked to the director, and she said, we'd love to have you come play Santa at our deal. She had to tell me how to get there. It was in a nondescript apartment building with nothing. It was a safe house. But I did that 2 years. And when we moved to Texas, there were several years where I managed to, my hair was starting to turn, and I was starting to fill out. And I did some Christmas. I did a thing here and there down here. But in later years, since 2011, I've done. Ernestine's mom was in a rehab and Alzheimer's facility here in town, and this next week will be the 4th time I've done their Christmas program. Last year I was very honored, and I get to do it again this Christmas morning, to go to Children's Medical Center. They have the need for 2 Santas to visit all the rooms for the children on Christmas morning. And last year when I walked in, and they do all their staging in an auditorium, it looked like, Steve's not here, I wanted him to hear this, it looked like Christmas Care Angels on steroids. There were black bags all over that auditorium, and each bag was for a patient. And I get to go back this year, and I'm looking forward to it. So that's how Santa grew out of our experiences. An opportunity to give back. At work, our company, Pizza Hut, has worked with an organization called the Snowball Express, and I don't know if any of you are familiar with that. It's an organization that supports military families who've lost somebody since 9/11. So they bring people in from all over the country for about a 4-day mini vacation, and everybody there has lost somebody. This year, because of scheduling and the way that they were doing things, I didn't get to go, but I'd gone 2 years in a row. And it was great to have the hugs from the kids and just to talk to them. Last year, something stood out in my mind. A lady with her children were standing in line, and after they had their picture taken, she said, "Can I have my picture taken with Santa?" And I said, "Sure." And she said, "Can I sit on the arm of the chair here?" And I said, "Sure." And so she took a picture, and she said, "Can I tell you what I want for Christmas?" And I said, "Sure." And she leaned over, and she said, "I want a man." Now that sounds weird, but I knew what she meant. I asked her, "How long has it been?" She said, 7 years. 2 Corinthians 1, 3 and 4 says, Praise be to the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Father of compassion, the God of all comfort. Now I can't see. Who comforts us in all of our troubles, so that we can comfort those in any trouble with the comfort we ourselves receive from God. And so, gentlemen, that's how Santa became a part of my life. Let me close this in prayer. Father, thank you for helping me get through that. Even with the stops and the teary eyes, thank you. It's your story. You've continued to do a work in our lives. We're still learning today what it's like to live with a miracle, and to adjust and constantly trust in you. But Father, I thank you for strength that we can know that in any situation, no matter what we're going through, we can count on you, we can trust you, and that we can receive that comfort and that peace that passes understanding. And that after we come out on the other side, that we can be bold and we can have a desire to comfort others in any way that we can in the struggles and the trials that they're going through. So, Father, I just thank you. I just give you praise and honor and glory in Jesus' name. Amen.